There comes a moment in every human life when the person you have been can no longer take you where your soul is trying to go. You feel it quietly at first, a strange dissatisfaction, a feeling that the life you once wanted no longer feels like the life you need. The same places no longer feel familiar. The same conversations no longer satisfy you. The same people may still surround you, yet something inside you feels strangely distant. You cannot always explain it. The same responsibilities. The difficult truth is that sometimes the life that feels like it is falling apart is actually the identity that has become too small for the person you are becoming. Throughout my work with the unconscious, I discovered that human beings rarely change simply because they want to. They change when remaining the same becomes more painful than becoming someone new. This is why transformation often begins with discomfort. The old identity starts feeling heavy. The beliefs that once protected you begin limiting you. The habits that once helped you survive begin preventing you from living. And the personality begins sending signals: restlessness, boredom, recurring dreams, emotional exhaustion. People often interpret these signs as failure, but sometimes they are invitations. The unconscious is telling you that something within you has outgrown the life you are currently living. Imagine a snake carrying its old skin. For a time, that skin protected it. It belonged to the snake. It was necessary. But eventually, the snake grows, and what once protected it becomes a prison. The snake does not hate its old skin. It taught you how to become agreeable, how to avoid conflict, how to seek approval, how to hide rejection, how to become whatever other people expected you to become. Perhaps that identity helped you survive childhood. Perhaps it helped you survive betrayal. Perhaps it helped you survive a relationship where your authentic self was not accepted. Do not hate that version of yourself. It did what it had to do. But understand this: a survival strategy can become a prison when the danger has already disappeared. This is where many people become trapped. They continue living according to rules created during a chapter that ended years ago. They still fear rejection that no longer exists. They still seek approval from people who are no longer present. They still silence emotions because someone once punished them for being honest. They still seek approval from people who are no longer present. They still silence. The past continues living through the personality, and unless consciousness interrupts it, the old self keeps making decisions for the new life. This is why letting your old self die is not about destroying yourself. It is about allowing an outdated identity to end. There is a profound difference. The ego often becomes terrified when it senses this process beginning. It asks, "Who will I be if I stop being this person?" That question creates fear, because the ego depends upon familiarity. It prefers a painful identity. It understands to an authentic identity it cannot yet predict. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest. Behind you is the road you know. Every tree is familiar. Every turn is predictable. Ahead, there is only darkness. You cannot see where the path leads. The ego says, "Go back." The self quietly says, "Keep walking." This is the beginning of individuation, the journey toward becoming who you actually are, rather than remaining who the world taught you to be. Most people never complete this journey. They stop at the first stage of discomfort. They return to familiar relationships, familiar habits, familiar fears. They call it stability. But sometimes, what did they believe? What did they fear? What did they need from other people? What did they tolerate? What did they chase? Now ask yourself, how much of that person still lives inside you? Perhaps more than you realize. You may have changed your circumstances without changing your identity. You may have left one relationship only to repeat the same emotional pattern with another person. You may have changed careers, yet carried the same fear. True transformation begins when you stop asking, "What should I change around me?" and start asking, "What must change within me?" That question is uncomfortable, because now there is nowhere to hide. You can no longer blame circumstances for everything. You must look at your own patterns, your reactions, your attachments, your fears, your expectations, your hidden needs, your shadow. The shadow contains the parts of yourself you have rejected or refused to acknowledge. Your anger, your jealousy, your ambition, your insig but never ambitious, confident but never assertive, forgiving but never protective. They divide themselves. One part becomes acceptable, another part is pushed into darkness, but what you reject does not disappear. It enters the unconscious, and eventually it demands recognition. This is why people sometimes behave in ways that surprise even themselves. A calm person suddenly explodes, a generous person becomes resentful. Eventually, the suppressed self pushes toward consciousness, and when that happens, you may feel as though you are becoming someone completely different. Perhaps you are, but not someone false, someone more complete. This is the frightening beauty of psychological transformation. You are not becoming someone you have never been. You are recovering parts of yourself that were buried beneath adaptation. The child who learned to stay quiet begins speaking. The person who always sought approval begins choosing independently. The person who feared loneliness begins discovering solitude. The person you may miss the person you used to be. You may miss their certainty, their routines, their relationships, their predictable world. That does not mean you are going backward. Grief is often part of transformation. Every new identity requires the burial of something old. The seed must disappear before the tree can emerge. The caterpillar must surrender its old form before becoming something capable of flight. And the human being must sometimes surrender the identity that once kept them alive, so the authentic self can finally begin living. Perhaps this is what is happening to you now, because the old you is no longer convincing, and the new you has not yet fully arrived. Do not rush to fill that emptiness. Sit with it. Listen to it. Something is being born there. The unconscious is rearranging your life from the inside, and if you have the courage to remain present, you may discover that the person you were afraid to lose was never the person you were meant to remain. There is a moment when you realize that the person you have been trying so hard to protect is the very person you must finally let go. Not physically, psychologically, the old identity, the old fears, the old habits, the old story, because the ego does not easily surrender its familiar identity. Even when that identity is making you miserable, it is still familiar, and familiarity has a strange power over the human psyche. A person may remain inside an unhappy relationship simply because loneliness feels more frightening. They may remain inside a career they hate because uncertainty feels more dangerous. They may continue pleasing everyone because rejection feels unbearable. They may repeat the same emotional patterns for years because at least those patterns are known. The unconscious often chooses familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. This is why people say they want change, yet unconscious often chooses familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. They want a new life, but they do not want to lose the identity that created the old one. That contradiction creates enormous psychological tension. You cannot become new while continuously protecting the old. Something must eventually be surrendered. Perhaps it is your need to be understood. Perhaps your need to be admired. Perhaps your need to control every outcome. Perhaps your belief that you must always be strong. Perhaps your attachment to people who only recognize your old identity. Whatever it is, the unconscious will eventually bring it into the light. And when it does, you may feel as though your entire world is being taken apart. But sometimes, life is not destroying your world. It is removing the walls you built around yourself. There is a difference. The old self often survives through repetition. You think the same thoughts. You respond to the same triggers. You choose similar people. You make similar decisions. Then you wonder why your life keeps producing similar outcomes. The unconscious is repetitive because it seeks completion. It keeps bringing you back to unfinished psychological material, until you finally become conscious enough to respond differently. The more often you react in the same way, the easier that reaction becomes. But there is good news. A path can disappear when it is no longer used. The same is true psychologically. Every time you respond consciously instead of automatically, you weaken the old pattern. Every time you say what you truly mean, instead of what you think people want to hear, the old identity becomes weaker. Every time you choose solitude instead of returning to an unhealthy relationship, the old identity becomes weaker. Every time you choose, that is profound psychological change. The old self survives through fear. The new self grows through awareness. This is why the journey toward authenticity can feel strangely lonely. The people around you may still expect the old version of you. They remember how you behaved. They remember what you tolerated. They remember how easily you agreed. They remember how available you were. And when you change, they may say, "You've changed." They are correct. You have. But change is not betrayal. Sometimes changing is the only way to stop betraying yourself. Not everyone will understand that. Easier to control. The moment you become conscious, you become less predictable. You begin questioning expectations. You begin setting boundaries. You begin choosing according to your values rather than your fears. This can make others uncomfortable. Do not mistake their discomfort for evidence that you are doing something wrong. A tree does not apologize for growing beyond the height people expected. Neither should you. There is another important realization. You do not need to destroy every part of your old self. Some parts deserve to survive. Your compassion, your memories, your lessons, your resilience, your ability to love. These are not the things that must die. Your compassion, your memories, your lessons, your resilience, your ability to love. These are not the things that must die. Your compassion, your memories, your lessons, your resilience, your ability to... The belief that kindness requires weakness, the belief that love requires self-sacrifice, the belief that strength means never asking for help, the belief that being alone means being unwanted, the belief that failure makes you worthless, the belief that your past determines your future. These are the identities that must be buried, not because they were always wrong, but because they are no longer capable of carrying you forward. The new self needs different foundations. It needs truth, responsibility, self-awareness, boundaries, courage, and above all, the willingness to face what you have spent years avoiding. That is where the shadow becomes important. You must also face the parts you are ashamed of, the anger you hide, the jealousy you deny, the insecurity you disguise, the ambition you pretend not to have, the need for recognition, the fear of being ordinary, the desire to control. These things do not make you evil, they make you human. What becomes dangerous is not having a shadow. What becomes dangerous is refusing to know it, because whatever remains unconscious fears are quietly making the decision. You may believe you are humble when you are actually afraid of confrontation. You may believe you are independent when you are actually afraid of intimacy. The unconscious is subtle. It hides behind beautiful explanations. That is why genuine self-knowledge requires brutal honesty, not self-hatred, honesty. You must be willing to ask yourself questions that make the ego uncomfortable. Why do I keep choosing this? Why does this person have so much power over me? Why am I afraid to say no? Why do I need everyone to approve of me? Why do I keep repeating the same mistake? These questions are doors. Behind each one, there is another part of yourself waiting to be understood. And once you understand it, you no longer need to be controlled by it. That is the beginning. The old self does not die in one dramatic moment. It dies through thousands of small decisions, a boundary, a truth, a refusal, a new habit, a different response, a courageous conversation, a decision to walk away, a decision to stay, a decision to finally choose what is right rather than what is familiar. One day, you look back and realize that the person who once controlled your entire life no longer exists. You still remember them. You may even feel compassion for them, but you no longer obey them. That is when you know the transformation has begun. The old self does not die in one dramatic moment. You may mistake it for emptiness. The things that once excited you no longer seem important. The conversations that once consumed your attention suddenly feel meaningless. The approval you once chased begins losing its power. Even certain dreams may begin disappearing. This can be frightening, because you have spent so much time believing that these things were you. You believed your career was you, your relationship was you, your reputation was you, your past was you, but the self is much deeper than all of these things. The ego builds an identity from experiences. For Vinny, the ego experiences the loss of its familiar identity as a threat. It asks, if I am no longer this person, who am I? That question cannot always be answered immediately, and perhaps it should not be. There is a period in transformation when you must allow yourself to exist without a final answer. You must become comfortable with uncertainty. You must allow the old identity to dissolve before demanding that the new identity become clear. This is one of the hardest things for the human mind to accept. We want labels, we want certainty, we want to know exactly who we are, but individuation does not happen through a single definition. It happens through discovery. It asks if by confronting contradictions, by experiencing failure, by entering relationships, by leaving relationships, by discovering what brings you alive and what slowly destroys you. The unconscious reveals the self through experience. That is why your life cannot be separated from your psychological development. Every experience becomes material. Every encounter becomes information. Every difficult chapter becomes another opportunity to misunderstand you. You stop explaining decisions to people who have already decided to misunderstand you. You stop chasing relationships that require you to become smaller. You stop performing happiness when you are unhappy. You stop pretending certainty when you are confused. And slowly, your life begins becoming honest. Honesty can be uncomfortable because it removes the excuses. Once you know what you truly want, you can no longer pretend you do not know. Once you recognize a pattern, you can no longer blame every repetition on circumstances. Once you understand why you keep returning to the same kind of person, you must eventually decide whether you are willing to choose differently. Awareness, the moment you become conscious of your old self, you become responsible for allowing it to continue. This is why transformation cannot be achieved simply by understanding psychology. You must live differently. You can read hundreds of books about boundaries and still allow people to violate yours. You can understand the shadow and still refuse to confront your own. You can know exactly why you seek approval and still continue seeking it. Knowledge is not transformation. Integration is. The truth must move from your mind into your behavior. That is when the old self truly begins dying. Imagine standing at the edge of a river. 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 Imagine standing psychology. Measure its depth. Imagine standing at the edge of a river. 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 But eventually, you must step into it. Psychological growth works the same way. At some point, you must stop analyzing your life and begin living differently. Say the thing you have been afraid to say. Leave the place you know you have outgrown. Start the work you keep postponing. Set the boundary you have been avoiding. Forgive yourself for the person you once had to become. And then, keep walking. The old self will resist. It may tell you that you are making a mistake. It may remind you of everything you could lose. It may make you romanticize the past. This is normal. The ego often idealizes what is familiar, simply because it is familiar. Just because something has been part of your life for years does not mean it belongs in your future. Some people are chapters, some places are seasons, some identities are temporary homes, and sometimes you must leave the home that once kept you safe, not because it was worthless, because you have grown beyond its walls. There is grief in this. Let yourself grieve. Do not rush past it. You are allowed to miss the person you used to be. You are allowed to remember the dreams you once had. You are allowed to feel confused. You are allowed to mourn relationships that cannot follow you into your next chapter. Grief does not mean you made the wrong decision. And still be over. That is one of the deepest truths of psychological maturity. Not everything you love is meant to remain. Not everything you lose was a mistake. Not every ending needs an enemy. Some endings are simply endings. The unconscious understands this. The ego wants someone to blame. The self wants to understand, and understanding eventually brings peace. One day, you will notice that you are responding differently. Something that once triggered you no longer controls you. Someone who once had enormous power over your emotions suddenly becomes just another person. That is evidence of transformation. You are not becoming emotionless. You are becoming conscious of your emotions. You still feel anger, but anger no longer owns you. You still feel fear, but fear no longer makes every decision. You still feel sadness, but sadness no longer defines your identity. This is what it means to become psychologically mature. You do not destroy the ego, you put it in its proper place. The ego is useful. It helps you function in the world, but it was never meant to become the ruler of your entire existence. You do not destroy your life begins changing from the inside outward. You become less concerned with appearing successful and more concerned with being authentic, less concerned with being admired and more concerned with being at peace, less concerned with controlling the future and more capable of trusting yourself within uncertainty. This is the person the old self could never become, because the old self was built around survival. The new self is built around consciousness, and perhaps that is why you have been feeling the strange desire to leave certain things behind. Perhaps something inside you already knows. Not with regret, not with shame. Let the old self die with gratitude. Thank it for protecting you. Thank it for carrying you through the years when you did not know how to carry yourself. Then, release it, because the person you are becoming deserves a life that the old you could never have imagined. There is a final stage of this transformation that many people never reach. It is the moment when you stop trying to become someone new and finally begin becoming who you were before fear taught you to become someone else. This distinction matters because the goal of psychological growth is not to manufacture a perfect personality. That would simply create another mask. The goal is integration, to become capable of holding every part of yourself without allowing any single part to control your entire life. You can be strong and still be vulnerable. You can be independent and still need others. You can be kind and still have boundaries. You can forgive and still walk away. You can love someone and still understand it believed everything had to be one thing or another, strong or weak, good or bad, loved or rejected, successful or worthless. But the mature psyche understands complexity. Human beings contain contradictions, confident and uncertain, generous and protective, social and private. There is no requirement to destroy one side in order to become the other. Wholeness means allowing these parts to exist consciously. This is why the shadow must be integrated rather than eliminated. The anger you once feared may contain your ability to defend yourself. The ambition you once judged may contain your desire to create. The solitude you once considered loneliness may contain your deepest capacity for perception. Everything depends upon consciousness. A quality becomes destructive when it remains unconscious. But once you understand, this is the great transformation. You stop fighting yourself. You begin listening to yourself. And that changes the relationship you have with your own mind. For years, perhaps you treated certain emotions as enemies. You tried to suppress them, hide them, ignore them, but emotions rarely disappear when ignored. They simply move deeper into the unconscious. Then they return through other doors. Anxiety, irritability, dreams, compulsive behavior, relationship. If you refuse to release an outdated identity, life may eventually force the transformation through crisis. A relationship collapses, a career ends, a friendship disappears, a dream fails, a familiar world suddenly becomes unfamiliar. At first, It feels like destruction, but sometimes, crisis is simply the unconscious removing what the ego refused to release. This does not mean every painful event was secretly meant to happen. It means every experience can become material for consciousness. You cannot control everything that happens to you, but you can decide what you become your identity. Perhaps you were rejected. But rejection does not have to become your self-image. Perhaps someone betrayed you, but betrayal does not require you to become incapable of trust forever. Perhaps you failed, but failure does not have to become your name. Your experiences are chapters. They are not the entire book. The old self often believes otherwise. It takes one painful experience and turns it into a permanent rule. I was rejected, therefore I am unworthy. I was betrayed, distance between experience and identity. I failed, therefore I am a failure. This is how trauma becomes identity. The conscious individual interrupts the process. I failed, therefore I am a failure. This is how trauma becomes identity. The conscious individual interrupts and inside that distance, freedom becomes possible. You are not every thought that passes through your mind. You are not every emotion you experience. You are not every mistake you have made. You are the consciousness capable of observing them. That observer is closer to the self, and the more you identify with it, the less power the old identity possesses. One day, you may encounter someone who knew you years ago. They may look at you and say, "You are not the same person," and for the first time, you will not feel the need to defend yourself. You will simply smile, because they are right. You are not the same person, and for the first time you will not feel the need to defend yourself. You have stopped chasing certain things. You have started valuing others. You have become less interested in proving yourself, and more interested in knowing yourself. That is growth. It does not always look impressive from the outside. Sometimes it looks like leaving quietly. Sometimes it looks like staying alone. Sometimes it looks like starting again. Sometimes it looks like forgiving yourself. The world may not recognize these victories, but the unconscious does. Every conscious choice becomes another brick in the foundation of your new identity. Eventually, you stop needing to consciously remind yourself. The new behavior becomes natural. You simply have them. You no longer have to practice self-respect. You begin expecting it. You no longer have to convince yourself that you are worthy. You simply stop negotiating your worth. This is when the old self has truly died. Not when you forget who you were, but when who you were no longer controls who you are. And perhaps that is the greatest freedom available to a human being, to remember your past without being imprisoned by it, to honor the person you once were, without becoming them again, to remember your past without being imprisoned by it. Because life is not asking you to remain loyal to an identity that was created for a world you have already outgrown. Life is asking you to become conscious, to become whole, to become real. And sometimes, becoming real requires the courage to let the person you used to be finally disappear. And perhaps this is the moment you have been waiting for. Not the moment when everything becomes perfect, but the moment when you finally stop trying to return to who you used to be. Let that person rest. You do not need to hate your past. You do not need to erase your mistakes. You do not need to pretend that the old version of you never existed. Let that person rest. You do not need to hate your past. You do not thank them, and then release them. Because your past was never meant to become your prison. It was meant to become your teacher. The pain you experienced taught you what you would no longer tolerate. The failures taught you what needed to change. The loneliness taught you how to hear yourself. The endings taught you that not everything is meant to remain. And the moments when you felt completely lost may have been the moments when your old identity was finally losing its control over you. Remember, you are allowed to outgrow yourself. You are allowed to begin again. The person you become tomorrow does not owe permanent loyalty to the person you were yesterday. This is not betrayal. This is evolution. So if something inside you has been telling you that an old chapter is finished, listen. If a relationship no longer reflects who you are becoming, Be honest. If an old habit keeps pulling you backward, release it. If an identity was built entirely around fear, let it die. And if the world does not need to understand your transformation for it to be real, some transformations happen in silence. Some of the most important deaths in your life will never be visible to anyone else. An old belief dies, an old fear dies, an old attachment dies, an old version of yourself dies, and quietly, something new begins. That is the mystery of psychological transformation. You do not become someone else, you become more completely yourself. So let the old self die, not with anger, not with shame, but with gratitude, because the person you were did the best they could, and now it is your turn to do better. Your life is still unfolding. The story is not finished.